It's just after I see a movie, I like to go get a piece of pie and talk about it. It's sort of a little tradition I have. Do you like to get pie after you see a good movie?
Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Queer Film Podcast. I'm your host, Brian Rowe, and this week I'm here with my friend and contributor, Chris. Hey, welcome back.
Thank you for having me back.
It's always a fun conversation when you come on, and I know that we've covered Oscar-nominated performances before in talking about straight actors playing queer. And so I'm glad we're able to do this pairing right in the midst of Oscar season. Because both of these movies, anyone who's clicked the button knows that we're covering Philadelphia and Dallas Buyers Club, and both of these movies won acting awards for cis straight people playing queer, and we'll get into all of that. But so thank you for agreeing to talk about this. This is also a couple of problematic movies that I was telling you my other contributors kind of didn't want to touch because of how problematic they are, and I agree they're problematic, and I don't in any way want to encourage people to watch them because they are that problematic. However, I think they're important and they're worth talking about in the context of queer cinema. And so that's why we're here. Here we are. And we'll start with, as we always do, with the first one that came out, Philadelphia in 1993. As everybody knows, Denzel Washington, Tom Hanks, directed by Jonathan Demme. Tom Hanks won his first of two Best Actor Academy Awards for playing Andrew Beckett, a man who was fired for having AIDS, and sues as a result. Chris, what did you think of this movie? What's your relationship to this movie? You had seen it before, right?
I had, but I had only watched it about 2 years ago. So I don't have a long history of being either a fan or even just someone who's seen this movie. But of course I was aware of it. I think right when it came out, because it was kind of a landmark movie, especially, for representing both gay people and someone with AIDS. There were not very many mainstream movies that did either of those things.
This was marketed as the first.
Yeah.
The first Hollywood movie to address an AIDS, a character with AIDS.
Yeah, and so it was I was really young at the time, too young, to watch this movie really at the time, or to have any interest really in watching it. But I was sort of the awareness of Oscars and stuff like that was already kind of hovering for me. I feel like there were a lot of years where I was sort of picking up through osmosis what movies were winning Oscars, and sort of almost mentally compiling a list of movies to eventually check out and watch. And this was just one of those movies because it, I wasn't aware of exactly what it was nominated for, but to me, it was one of the movies that most cut through the noise in 93 that I was most aware of. This and kind of Schindler's List, which won Best Picture that year, and I was really aware of that. Mainly because it was the same year Jurassic Park came out, and Steven Spielberg, directed both of those. So I was obviously really pulling for Jurassic Park at the Oscars. It won some technical awards. And so anything Steven Spielberg did was also kind of just oh, he's the Jurassic Park guy, I want him to win. But beyond that, I think this is the movie that personally would be top of mind, if you were to ask me about best actor winners in the early 90s or movies that were kind of in this conversation. So it always looms large for me. And I think, as someone who was a little kid, I didn't know anyone certainly with AIDS at the time, and didn't know a lot about it. And so it kind of gave a face to it for me, something that I could kind of identify with a single person. Tom Hanks, obviously an actor playing someone with AIDS, not having it, but it was kind of probably the first time that I was able to really put what AIDS looks like, kind of visualize someone who has that, because I'd seen the pictures or clips of the movie.
Yeah. I think Tom Hanks' casting is kind of what got this movie what got a mainstream audience to watch this movie. And I think it's a very early, and we've talked a lot on this podcast about like straight actors playing gay. This was 1993 in a time when it didn't happen. Like straight actors just didn't play gay. To do it in a movie like Philadelphia, where he's dying and he's dying very specifically of AIDS, to cast someone like Tom Hanks, who at the time, was coming off of like Sleepless in Seattle and Joe versus the Volcano and an Oscar nomination for Big, like known as like this sort of comedic actor, to give this like, and also like a really friendly, sort of approachable seeming kind of everyman, to cast him in this role is very deliberate. And I think it's probably, like I said, it's the reason this movie got made. It's the reason so many people saw this movie. I remember watching this with my family. We watched a lot of Tom Hanks movies together. We watched Big and Joe versus the Volcano and Splash and Turner and Hooch. And so watching this with my family in that context, like didn't really mean anything to me, because it just felt like, oh, we watch this guy's movies all the time. I don't think I was looking at it as it's a movie about a guy with AIDS. I certainly, that wasn't a thing that was on my radar. I don't think at that point in my life. I would have been 12, going on 13, and I think any inclination that I might have had, I was furiously burying and not even acknowledging to myself. So I don't remember that having a sort of an impact in watching it, but I do remember we watched it, and I remember my mom cried, and it was like you and like a lot of other people, I think it was the first time I was ever really been made aware of AIDS. Like I said, I was 12, so I remember like the late 80s, like Elton John concerts with Elizabeth Taylor and like Ryan White. Do you know who Ryan White is?
Sort of.
He was like this little straight boy that got HIV
through
a blood transfusion.
Okay. I do remember
and he kind of became this innocent face of AIDS until his untimely passing, of course. And I remember knowing what it was, but I don't remember any sort of controversy about us watching Philadelphia. I also remember I remember watching like Oscar movies with my parents too. Like I remember we watched Dances with Wolves. Like I said, so the gay thing didn't really like, that wasn't something I was thinking of when I was watching it. It was just sort of the sad movie we watched with my parents. It's interesting now as an adult, 30 years later, to watch it. It does get a few things right. I do think that Tom Hanks casting I think it's good casting, because I do think it makes it palatable in a certain way. And I think Denzel is very good. Denzel's one of my favorite actors. Like, I don't want to say I've never seen him give a bad performance, because he has, but it's not in this one. Yeah, I don't know. So like I said, watching it at the time, it wasn't very controversial, and I didn't really understand. I do remember watching that Oscars because I remember Tom Hanks. It's the whole, we talked about this when we did In and Out, because his speech outing his gay teacher, or his speech talking about a gay teacher, inspired Paul Rudnick to write In and Out. And so I remember all that. I remember Schindler's List winning. I remember this is like an early Oscar ceremony that I remember watching, because I remember watching, and I had seen, I think Schindler's List was another one too that we watched. Like I said, so we watched Oscar movies too. So it didn't really rate in that way. Watching it now though, like I said, I think it's a little problematic. So I sent you the link to Larry Kramer's review, which made some really good points and a couple of racist ones. But the one that stuck with me that he said was, and a lot of gay people at the time were saying this, was that this movie doesn't represent me or any gay person that I know or any person with HIV that I know. And that was a common refrain at the time. Like I said, it's not something I was aware of at 13, but looking back, it's very much there. And I think if I was an adult at the time, I would have been on Larry Kramer's side.
I don't really agree with his piece. I mean, I think he makes some good points. But there's also like a lot of points that I think are just not that well made. And, like he at one point says like, this movie won't make any money. Blatantly wrong. It made over $200 million. It was one of the top 10 movies of the year. I get like Larry Kramer, you know, obviously was very involved in um, shedding light on this disease and telling this story early on, you know, much earlier than Philadelphia came out. So I completely understand his desire for more. But I also think that the movie that there were people like Larry Kramer already doing that, and not, you know, on the scale of a movie like Philadelphia. That just, you know, that's a door that needed to be opened, you know, kind of gradually. And Philadelphia is kind of the movie that, you know, at least in part, you know, set out to start opening that door. And I think the movie, because it was such a hit and because it got such visibility with the Oscars, I think it's still a movie that, if, you know, you ask people, for better or worse, you know, but, you know, like, what's a movie about AIDS? I think it's still probably the first movie that comes to mind for a lot of people, and it's still in people's heads. But I think it was a really important time for this movie to reach the audience that it did reach, which wasn't the audience of Larry Kramer, who obviously was, you know, much more knowledgeable about this and knew a lot of gay people. This movie was really made for an audience of people. I mean, you know, it was made for everyone, but I think the primary reason that it was being made was to reach an audience of people that thought that they didn't know anyone with AIDS and didn't have to care about it.
Right.
And so, and, you know, we'll get into like the specifics, I think, of how the movie does this specifically, but in general, just, I think that is kind of the, maybe not more important, but was very important at the time, because this disease had been kept so silent. I mean, silence was really the biggest enemy of AIDS, especially, you know, through the 80s. You know, it wasn't even mentioned for the longest time by Reagan or, you know, other politicians. It was something that was kind of just being swept under the rug. And so what really needed to happen in this moment is that it needed to be made really visible to an audience, that the audience that was able to ignore it up until this point. And I think that the movie, you know, in most ways did accomplish that and does it well. And I actually really like this movie, so I'll just come out and say that. You know, now, you know, just to make it clear that, you know, we're sort of on opposite sides again, on a movie. Yeah, and it wasn't a movie, you know, that I was really invested in before I watched it for this podcast. I liked it the last time I saw it, but I didn't really think too hard about it. I was mostly watching it, you know, just to see Tom Hanks's performance for the first time. And this time I really like kind of dug into it a little bit, and kind of where the culture was at the time, and also just like really paid attention to kind of how it framed the story, which, you know, I'll go into more specific thoughts later. But in general, I was just really impressed with this movie, and did find it very, very moving. And so, yeah, with Larry Kramer, I mean, yeah, he makes a couple of good points. He makes a couple of bad points. He makes a couple, or at least one racist point, which is weird. But I get that. I get that argument, you know, that you have, this is something that you've been dealing with for, you know, a decade, and you've seen your friends die, and you've created art that speaks, you know, more directly to the community that's most affected by this. So I absolutely get why he would watch this movie and be sort of disappointed. But I think like there were a lot of people making art from that perspective, and this is a movie that sought to kind of tackle it for a different audience. And I think that's also something that needed to happen, and really valid. And I thought it was done well for that audience.
Yeah, I don't I gave this movie is 2 stars on my Letterboxd. I don't actively dislike it. There's a lot here that works. I think, like I said, I think Tom Hanks is good in it. I think Denzel is good in it. I actually think my favorite performance, maybe not my favorite performance, but a performance that doesn't get talked about, is Mary Steenburgen, who I think is great. Like, I've always loved her. I've loved her ever since, honestly, Back to the Future 3. But I think she's very good in the movie.
Casting her, sorry, casting her as the villain is such a like maverick move, I think, just because like she's so likable, you know.
Yeah.
And even in this movie, she's almost likable, even though she's like the lines that she's saying, she's like a pretty horrible person, like defending, you know, a corporate, basically corporate bigotry, but and doing it with a smile on her face. But you kind of can't help. And then at one point, you know, she says like, "I hate this case," which she actually like was not really in the script, but because she was so conflicted about having to play this character, like Jonathan Demme was like, yeah, go ahead and just, you know, say that if you want to, because like she wanted to show that this person was a human, even though, you know, she's kind of doing the indefensible in the case. So anyway, I had to.
Oh no, it's fine. I actually think that line is, I know I read that too, that on the Internet Movie Database, that it was sort of ad-libbed in the moment, but I also think that line is a key to that character and that performance. Because she does elicit sympathy when she says that. Like, you can you have this moment of like, yeah, like you said, everything she's been saying is like monstrous and offensive. Like, but for her to turn and say, I hate this case, like there's that sliver of like, she knows it. And she even probably, you get the sense that she probably even knows she's wrong in this instance and that this case is wrong and that they're going to lose. But she's got to do her job. And I like that. I like that moment. And like I said, I think that moment is key to her performance. And I like that performance a lot. The reason it's 2 stars and not higher on my Letterboxd is because I find it a difficult, like I was saying, I find it difficult to recommend. I'm probably never going to watch it again. There's a lot about it that evokes like negative feelings, and I watch it, and that, like I was just talking about Mary Steenburgen, but that scene when she's like quizzing him about like, did you know when you went into this movie theater that people had sex there? Like, did you know these play these? That's such a like, again, I love Mary Steenburgen and I love her performance in this, but I also like, fuck you, like, and fuck this movie and fuck Jonathan Demme for like putting the camera in her face and making that. Jonathan Demme does that a lot. He does those like close-ups where the actor is talking to or looking at the camera.
Well, yeah, I mean, so we talked about Larry Kramer, but the writer of this movie is also gay, so we should note that. So it was made by Jonathan Demme, who's a straight man. Obviously, the 2 stars are straight, but it was written by a gay man whose nephew had died of AIDS, and a lot of that is personally in here. So it's not like it's completely made without any, you know, kind of understanding or, you know, personal connection. And there's a lot of extras throughout the movie who really did have AIDS at the time. The crew, you know, was watching in many cases these, you know, actors in the smaller roles. A lot of them died, you know, before the movie came out or even before production ended. One of the guys who plays one of the corporate guys, who's in the movie, is, you know, straight and bigoted, although he's the most kind of sympathetic one of those. And he had AIDS at the time. He's the one who kind of knew what was going on a little bit and kind of held back from telling the other partners. And at one point they asked, like, did you know? And he was like, well, you know, not really, but really means yes. And anyway, he died of AIDS shortly after, like 4 months after the movie was released, and almost wasn't able to play his role. So there were a lot of people who were really knowledgeable about it on set, and the people who didn't come into the movie, you know, starting off really knowledgeable about it, certainly were by the end, because they were literally watching it happen, you know, with the people who were in the movie and advising on the movie. So I just think that's an important context to kind of note, that like it was a part of this production, whether or not it was, you know, kind of the director and the stars. But yeah, I mean, when you say that, I do think there is a lot that's uncomfortable in this movie, and that's why I really like it, is because I think there's like things like, you know, what Mary Steenburgen says that you still hear today, you know, that that
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Like
basically
that woman
implying
probably, if this was a true story, that woman would probably have a show on Fox News right now.
exactly, and she's speaking really to that sort of implication that gay men are deviant, engaging in risky sexual behavior, so in a sense they deserve it, or they've kind of earned getting AIDS in a way that straight people don't, obviously,
Yeah. I think
in
that's
her
what,
eyes.
I think that's the thing that kind of bothers me about the movie is it doesn't feel like a hateful movie. Like it doesn't feel like it's coming from a place where they want to put these people down or anything like that. But at the same time, I think the reason that I respond so viscerally to Mary Steenburgen's like line of questioning is because it feels to me like that's kind of it feels to me that's the point of view of the movie, that the movie is saying like, it sucks that this happens, but this guy did this to himself. It really feels like it wants to acknowledge the horrors of AIDS and of dying of AIDS, but it doesn't feel sympathetic to the gay people in the movie. They feel very sort of disposable. And I think that's what really bothers me about the movie.
I couldn't disagree really more. Is I think it makes me cry. Like I cried watching the special features. I cried listening to the commentary, and just like when watching the movie itself. So I was like very, very moved, especially by the end of the movie, but really throughout. But I mean, I think to the point that I think what people kind of negatively respond to the movie now is saying that it's not enough about Tom Hanks's character.
He's a very he's a very asexual character. Like that's another thing. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well,
continue.
Okay. Yeah. He also is dying of AIDS, so it would be kind of, not that at the degree that he's at for most of the movie, like he's probably not going to be, having a lot of sex. But anyway,
fair. That's fair.
But to me, like the movie is not really trying to completely be about a character dying of AIDS. To me, the movie is about putting America on trial for dismissing AIDS. And the character in the movie that really goes on a journey is Denzel Washington's character. Tom Hanks, they're co-leads. I don't think it's necessarily one or the other story, but I think Tom Hanks remains pretty constant throughout the movie and is not the one who really has a journey to go on. Denzel Washington starts the movie being incredibly homophobic, but beyond that, misinformed about AIDS, and also just like he doesn't even really want to shake Tom Hanks's character's hand, like when he comes into the office, doesn't want to take the case, and the case itself is about Tom Hanks being fired for having AIDS, and basically, I think in a larger sense, the movie is just about straight America not wanting to deal with AIDS, wanting to ignore it, wanting it to go away, thinking it's someone else's problem. And so the movie is about Denzel's journey from having that attitude toward not necessarily being like less homophobic, or, he's not gonna, I don't think he's gonna go out and make a bunch of gay friends at the end of this movie. Like it's not like a kind of a cliche, like 180-degree transformation for him.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not that he's becoming someone who like loves and admires homosexuality and or even necessarily like supports it, but he has gone on a journey from not even wanting to like look at this man, not wanting to look him in the eye, to believing that he is a human being and deserves the same rights as everybody else. And I think that's what the movie really is about. It takes place in Philadelphia, which is the city of brotherly love, obviously the city that the Declaration of Independence was written in, where these rights were first conceived of, and obviously conceived in a way that, as far as we know, weren't really taking homosexuality into consideration,
Right.
whatsoever. Obviously it was a different time. They probably didn't even think that would ever, become an issue, but, wrote the words like all men are created equal. And, the law has to uphold, the Constitution. That's what it is. So to have it take place there and to have this story be about both one man going on this journey toward, kind of making that small realization, and also, kind of holding corporate America, represented by these rich white straight men, holding them accountable for not, for taking away those rights. I found it like really, really moving and kind of a statement, just that like putting it in this setting, I found like really made it kind of a very like quintessentially American story, and kind of quietly made the statement that isn't really like echoed that much in the actual dialogue, but just like, this is the story of equality, again, and people with AIDS are the same as everybody else, and we need to like uphold their rights the same as everybody else and treat them as humans, the way that we've had to realize that, slaves are humans at some point, and, that people have, like, all people really need the same rights that, at one point were just afforded to basically like white men.
Yeah. Well, he says as much in the movie. He's like, these people are disgusting, but he was fired for this, and that's not right. And he's right, like, you're right, but like, I guess for me the thing is, this is maybe the Larry Kramer point of view, but it's this sense of like, yeah, it's sort of putting America on trial, but it's also letting a lot of America off the hook for ignoring it for so long. And this movie should have come out, 10 years sooner, or 5 years sooner, even in 93. So you figure, yeah. And so it's easy for me to see how Larry Kramer, after years of doing his fighting, and this is another thing that I wrote down that I thought was interesting. It's like 2 years after Angels in America, which is of course the Tony Kushner, like, Pulitzer winning play. So like, we've seen that depiction before, and it just feels, we've seen an honest, like, sort of depiction of AIDS and what it looks like. And this just feels like a very watered down, too little, too late version that feels kind of like it's taking the side of the oppressor, in the sense that, like I was saying earlier, what it reads to me is that the movie's kind of saying, yes, they're acknowledging that, yes, it's not right for that to happen, but again, that these faggots did it to themselves, is the sense that I get from the movie, because you center on the Denzel Washington character, and you give the Denzel Washington character that arc. Why does it take a gay man dying for a straight person to realize our personhood? We shouldn't have to die before that happens.
No, we shouldn't have to, but it did. It did have to.
Sure.
Happen. And I mean, you're saying it's too little too late, but it was also the first. So
yeah, I mean,
Angels in America was a Broadway show. The audience for a Broadway show is very different than the audience for a Hollywood movie. So,
well, yeah, absolutely.
Theater is always, pushing harder. Usually, like is more, kind of risque and more experimental than like a mainstream movie, especially in these days, before there were a lot of like independent movies, and you could get more niche. But I think, I don't think this movie is on the side of the oppressor at all. I mean, it's literally about a trial that is, that they lose. And I think for most people to see this movie at the time, they had to have a character like Denzel Washington in there.
Yeah, you need that like middle America, like surrogate.
Like, right? They're not going to see Angels in America. Like most of the people who've seen, most of Middle America, has not seen Angels of America still, and even though there was a movie, um,
Yeah.
with big stars in it, but because it's too gay for a lot of people, they have not seen it. And this was really kind of like, to me, it's like the door was closed
Yeah.
for 90% of these people, and this movie kind of opened the door.
Right.
Didn't it wasn't like it guided everyone through it. Obviously, not a single movie could really even accomplish that, possibly,
Right.
but it couldn't be all things to all people. It couldn't both be the movie that Larry Kramer wanted to see and the movie that middle America would see.
Right. Yeah, of course.
And that doesn't necessarily make it good. That there are a lot of movies that make those concessions that are not good. But I think this one really is very smart and savvy about the way that it tells the story. I think throughout it kind of quietly equates this struggle with like, there's a Black woman on the stand, the witness stand, testifying for Tom Hanks's work performance.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up. That was a great scene. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it was. I mean, and it really stands out, even though, I mean, that actress, Anna Devere Smith, I believe is her name. She's a big theater actress, so I've seen her before, but she does a lot with just like a pretty small role. But it's, she's basically, calling out Mary Steenburgen and the company as like saying like, yeah, I'm a Black woman who, got a promotion at this job, but that doesn't mean like I don't experience racism here. And that isn't part of the same thing that Tom Hanks, was fired for. Right. It's like, there are a couple of characters who I feel like kind of draw those connections. And so I think it really smartly kind of makes this fight, it kind of equates it a little bit with civil rights and just this ongoing sort of struggle for people who are not straight white people to be seen in America.
Yeah.
And to be recognized and to be given, the same rights that they were. And I think it's easy to look back on it now and criticize it if you like totally take it out of context of the time. But for it being, the first mainstream movie to do this on the scale, and for it to have worked, I really think it did. It really did, I think, put like a kind of a sympathetic face on AIDS for a lot of people, and not just people who were uncaring, but even someone, like a kid like me who just wasn't exposed to anything else at this time, to like say like, oh, like a character, that I like Tom Hanks, like if that's the kind of person that can have AIDS, when what you're hearing from other places is that like these people are deviants and deserve it, and it's not a problem that most Americans have to deal with, so we can just kind of let those people kind of exist in their corner and kill each other off, basically. Like that's kind of the message that you're getting, definitely from conservative America at a certain point, and still in certain parts of it. But and then when you finally put that on the face, I mean, it's a little simplistic, but at the time, most people are not going to Broadway shows and being exposed to that much art about this. And so I think it really is an important moment of visibility that kind of probably, I think, did change a lot of minds, or at least, made them more open and made them more receptive to thinking more about like who these people really were, rather than just dismissing them.
Yeah. I don't want to say in any way that this movie, because like I said, when I watched it as a 12 or 13-year-old in 1993, I didn't equate it with myself or anything else. But one of the other things about it that kind of rubs me the wrong way, and maybe this is just me being overly sensitive, and it probably is, but and this movie didn't create in any way like my fear of AIDS and therefore a fear of sex. but it didn't help it either. And I think looking back on it, I think to have those sorts of, there's a lot of, like I said, you're right. Like, you know, it features that scene with that actress whose name you just said I don't remember. So that, yeah, there's moment.
I think, yeah.
Say that again.
Anna Devere Smith, I think, is her name.
Thank you. But at the same time, I guess it just, like I said, it feels like it really sort of demonizes. It's like, it feels subtle in a way because you don't see, like I said, Tom Hanks is a very asexual character, and you're right. Like, if he's dying of AIDS, he's absolutely not going to be having sex, but that doesn't mean he's not going to be seeing his friends or cuddling with his boyfriend or seeing his larger gay community. His entire community, according to this movie, is his boyfriend and his family and his lawyer and his job. And there's
a scene at, he has a party and he has a bunch of gay people there.
And Quentin Crisp is there.
Yeah.
Which I didn't spot him, actually. I read that but I read it after the fact, so I didn't go back and look for it, but I didn't spot him.
And the extras there, almost all of them were actually like men with AIDS, by the way.
But that scene is very much about him and his lawyer. Like, his lawyer's there and he's like, oh, welcome, and like he's meeting people. There's not a lot of, it's just not a very like queer looking party. It just looks very heteronormative. And again, like I said, you know, it's easy with the benefit of hindsight, because like I said too, I do remember watching this with my parents, and if Tom Hanks hadn't been in it, there's no way they're going to watch a movie about AIDS. And it definitely did get eyes on it in a way that casting two queer actors wouldn't have done, because no one would have heard of them. And I think that's the other reason I can't fully like dislike it either, because I've seen in my own life that it has gotten people that I love to watch this movie and expose them to this character. And I think for me, part of it is like, like Larry Kramer said, it doesn't feel like it reflects my life in any way. So if they're watching this and relating it to me, it's a complete fabrication. And maybe that's more on the people watching it than the movie itself. But like I said, I think that's why I have trouble with it.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I'll just say, like, I think like the party scene has him and Antonio Banderas, who's his partner. They're dancing like very intimately, and I think that scene actually does so much that like a sex scene or, you know, like having them make out like doesn't do. It's like an actual like intimate scene, but that also feels real in the moment. There was a scene of the two of them in bed together that was cut out just for the fact that it didn't work. I watched it. It was on the Blu-ray, and it isn't a great scene. It definitely deserved to be cut out, you know, not just because it wasn't cut out because, you know, like people would be, you know, offended by seeing them in bed. But there's a lot of moments where they don't make out, but they like Antonio Banderas kisses him on the hand or on the forehead or something. So it's not shying away from showing them. And there have been, you know, partners for at least like a decade in the movie. So I feel like it's a lot more believable. I feel like it would be kind of weird if they were, you know, making out, you know, it's a courtroom.
I'm not saying they need to make out. It just, aside from the scene where they're dancing, it doesn't feel very, and that's a very short scene, and it just doesn't feel like there's much.
Well, I get
the script gives them much.
I get a little irritated with the like argument that all gay characters always have to be shown having sex or something too, because it's like, again,
that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying they have to be making out, and I don't want to see a sex scene with Tom Hanks in it with anybody. I'll just watch a sex scene. Also, I'll watch a sex scene with Antonio Banderas, but
there are plenty to choose from.
I know.
Gay and straight.
Yeah, so I'm not that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying their relationship reads as very clinical and asexual, aside from the scene where they're dancing. And the kiss on the hand, doesn't, I guess, it just doesn't read as romantic really to me. I don't know.
Well, we can agree to disagree on that, I guess. But I find that they are very intimate together, much more so than I expected. Even after like reading the Larry Kramer piece, I was like, oh, okay, maybe he has a point about that. And then I watched it and I was like, oh wait, actually there are all these scenes where they are,
Yeah.
touching each other and being affectionate. I mean, in general, I think the movie we're basically seeing what the courtroom sees, with a couple of
Yeah.
exceptions, like the party. It's a courtroom movie. So I think, there's obviously not a lot of room for a whole lot of,
Yeah.
like him being, queer in different ways. But I think like for this type of movie, like putting the party scene in there and showing that he has friends, and there's a couple of scenes where you see that like his friends are like, he has gay friends around him who care about him. They're going to like the hospital to see him. So I felt like there was enough of that. But I also feel like the movie's kind of point of view is from that courtroom and just sort of seeing what you would see more or less from a guy on the stand, and not necessarily like showing too much of his personal life, because that's not what you would see if you were kind of like the jury. Like we're sort of put in the almost like we are the jury in a way. And so we're seeing like what we're seeing in the courtroom and kind of brief like snippets that kind of support that, but not a ton of stuff until the end, when we kind of follow him to the hospital. I did really like
There it is.
Jonathan Demme's. He kind of has a tick as a director in a lot of movies of having characters look the camera in the eye.
Mhm.
And I really liked that in this movie, just because I felt like right away it kind of established with the Hanks character, like you have to look this guy in the eye. Like I thought it was like kind of a declaration early on of like you need to kind of like respect and pay attention to this guy. That I found, I guess a little groundbreaking in a way, even though he had done that at least in Silence of the Lambs, if not maybe in other movies too. But and in that movie, I mean, a lot of that I think was done for the Jodie Foster character and kind of making her an equal of like the men in the FBI, that she needed to be kind of like looked in the eye with respect the same way. So I just really liked that technique, especially in this film, for the way it kind of forces you to empathize with him and like kind of humanize him right away. For a lot of us in the audience don't necessarily need it, but I think for maybe the people who did, it might have been an effective technique.
Yeah, I think it works like, I'm going to sound like my grandfather, but it works like gangbusters in Silence of the Lambs, particularly the interrogation scene with her and Anthony Hopkins, and with Anthony Hopkins looking into the camera. I think that in that movie it creates this tension because this insane person is staring you in the eye, and it's incredibly unsettling, and also B, you can't look away. It has a completely different effect in Philadelphia. But it's interesting. I'm glad you brought up Silence of the Lambs, because that was one of the notes I wanted to bring up, because it was said that he did this movie Jonathan Demme directed this as something of an apology for the perceived sort of transphobia in Silence of the Lambs, which there's a lot of it in Silence of the Lambs. Like that's kind of, I don't want to go down that road. But I just wanted to make sure we brought that up. Do you think this functions as sort of an apology for that, or what do you think of the two films in relation to each other?
I think that he just wasn't aware in Silence of the Lambs that was going to be an issue, that it took him by surprise. And I definitely see the argument for Silence of the Lambs, but it also was such a specific like serial killer character that it's like I never see it as like representative of anyone except for like that one very disturbing character. But I think what the relationship really is that like that he listened to that that outrage that arose over that movie and and I think that's it kind of opened him up to seeing that there was at least something that those people were saying. I think he recognized that it was a problematic trope. And so I think he was going into this movie with his mind really open and wanting to make sure that he got it right and doing the research and, having a lot of gay voices involved in somewhere along the line of this production, including the screenwriter. So I think he was just, like his mind was definitely trying to avoid doing something like that again, where he was sort of pissing off a community that he wasn't a part of. And ironically, in a smaller way with this movie, but he did like address the Larry Kramer article, like him and the screenwriter did in one of the special features that I watched. So, and he respects Larry Kramer as, and Tom Hanks did too. And so that, I think they believe that that's a valid opinion as well. And their point of view is kind of that they were making a movie that Larry Kramer, that Larry Kramer would necessarily have to hate, because it was meant for other people to watch it that would have hated the movie that Larry Kramer would have loved. So,
I mean,
obviously can't please everyone.
Right. That's a fair point. Because the movie that I'm asking for and that Larry Kramer was asking for is not a mainstream movie. And I think in terms of, well-meaning movies that seek to kind of address an injustice, I think this does a lot of stuff pretty well. And again, like I said, I watched it with my family. I know for a fact they wouldn't have watched it with another actor. And so I can't really hold a lot of that stuff against it, even if I personally find aspects of it to be somewhat objectionable. I can at least respect that it's of a time and that it was doing something that needed to be done. Which is why I wanted to pair it with Dallas Buyers Club. Because my initial reaction after seeing Dallas Buyers Club was, wow, all these years after Philadelphia, and we still can't get it right. Or Hollywood still can't get it right. Did you have any more though that you wanted to say on Philadelphia before we pivot?
No, this will be a good pivot point, because I mean the last thing really was just that I thought of In the Heat of the Night a lot while watching Philadelphia this time.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen that?
I have not actually, but I remember the TV show with Carol O'Connor. I've seen that.
I remember seeing at least like commercials for that show. But the movie won Best Picture back in 1967, and I think it also sometimes gets that like similar criticisms of like, oh, this movie didn't go far enough. Sidney Poitier got a lot of those criticisms for playing, kind of Black characters who were, in the eyes of some people, a little too much part of the establishment, not radical enough. But, again, with that movie is like, it was about as radical as it could be and be a movie that won Oscars at that time. So, and that movie similarly is basically it's a white cop in a southern town who is forced to kind of work with this Black northern cop, but in the South, he's obviously seen very differently than he's seen in the North. So it's kind of the journey of the white cop, kind of coming to respect this other man. And so obviously the comparisons are pretty obvious, but mostly in the kind of way that they're talked about now is that I really respect In the Heat of the Night a lot too, because of what it risked at the time. Even shooting down south was very, very dangerous for Sidney Poitier. in the 60s. So like you can look at it now and kind of say like, oh, it's just like a nice, like a white guy and a black guy getting along, and it's not, taking huge risks. But at the time it kind of was. And I feel the same way about Philadelphia too, is that it was actually a pretty risky film in 1993 that I think did have a pretty big impact probably on the culture, and just on the way that, first on making AIDS something that I think it kind of gave people a frame of reference to talk about AIDS that maybe they didn't have one before. And also just, I think it kept certain aspects of it in people's minds, and just like what it looks like, even though it's obviously a Hollywoodized version of that. And if they had watched a documentary or, something else, they might have had a better idea. But a lot of these people are not going to go to those lengths to seek out something. So it kind of has to be a piece of art that comes to them or meets them halfway. And so I think it's good on that level, in a way that Dallas Buyers Club may be risking a little bit less. I guess we'll see as we discuss it.
Well, I think that's good a place as any to just go ahead and pivot right on over to Dallas Buyers Club from 2013, starring Matthew McConaughey and Jared Leto. Tell us what were your thoughts rewatching this movie now today, this week for the podcast?
Wow, I had actually watched this about the same time that I first watched Philadelphia last. So that wasn't that long ago. That was like 2 years ago. And I thought it was okay. I saw it back in 2013. I should come clean and admit that my personal choice for Best Supporting Actor that year was Jared Leto in the Dallas Buyers Club. So I was never like wild about the movie, but I really did like those performances. Also Matthew McConaughey, who also won Best Actor for the movie. So it's a double Oscar winner.
It's one of only 5 movies to win both Best Actor and Supporting per the Internet Movie Database. But so go ahead.
Yeah. So, and as I've mentioned on this podcast, I think before, I've watched and rewatched a lot of Oscar movies, and I'm pretty much done with watching all the winning performances. So it was sort of just coming in that stew of like, how do I feel about these performances? So I really didn't think I was going to have a very different opinion, just a couple of years later. But watching this right after Philadelphia, I have to say it did not hold up to either my expectations really, or just obviously to Philadelphia, which I think is a far, far, far better movie. And the main thing, I mean, there's obviously some specifics to get into, but the main thing is sort of just like we talked a lot in our Philadelphia discussion, like what was the point of that movie, and it's pretty clear, I think, that it was, to address AIDS, which had mostly been kind of ignored in the media, and especially, by Hollywood. It was the first mainstream movie. This movie, that was exactly 30 years ago, by the way. This is exactly 10 years ago now. So they're both having anniversaries. And so this movie is a whole, like 20 years later. A lot has changed in the culture over those 20 years regarding both AIDS and sort of the mainstream perception of homosexuality. It's coming out sort of at the time that gay marriage is starting to become legalized in a lot more places. And it's just like, it's hard to like grasp really what I try and be generous a lot of times with these movies, because I don't really like the terms like Oscar bait, or I try not to be very cynical, at least these days. Maybe just as a reaction against everyone else being maybe too cynical. I'm just trying to be a contrarian. But with this one, it was hard not to be a little bit cynical and just kind of wonder like what exactly this movie was going for, like that it felt like why did the story need to be told, or what what was really driving people to make this movie.
Yeah, I think this is the worst kind of Oscar bait, where you insert a big name actor, a supporting actor who hasn't acted in 5 years, is this sort of comeback role, in a disease movie. It feels like the worst kind of Oscar bait. And I know that's not a phrase you enjoy, but if any movie has ever earned that phrase, it's this one, because it feels like, they famously, the main character, Ron Woodruff, was bisexual, and they made him straight, which is one of many things. It feels like they made him straight so that you could attract a big name star who wanted an Oscar. Like, it didn't want to be honest with his story. And there is a real story to be told. The buyers clubs were real things that people ran to get difficult to find or unavailable in the US drugs to AIDS patients. There's absolutely a story there. And that story is about the queer people and the lesbians that ran those clubs. Lesbians are the unsung heroes of the AIDS crisis. And this story feels like a slap in the face. You've created a trans character from thin air and given the role to a cis actor. You play fast and loose with the facts of the medication that they're talking about. They literally, according to the trivia, one of the actors that they cast had AIDS and had to correct them and say, like, a lot of this information is really wrong. The only thing I like about this movie is Jennifer Garner, because I find her very difficult to dislike.
But I do not like Jennifer Garner. I guess we found a point of contention. I actually hate her in this movie. I think she's terrible, and
she's not great in the movie, but I like her, and I like when she's on screen because I'm automatically engaged because of my affection for her. But it's not necessarily a great performance. But she does have a way of sort of furrowing her brow and just absolutely breaking my heart.
Oh my God, it seems so fake. It's a weird place to start this conversation.
It's okay.
But I even wrote down, like, she's trying so hard to do her concerned face. Like,
I know. Yeah, a little bit. It's not the best. It's not her. Like, she literally, like, I've seen her better in episodes of Alias on ABC. But at the same time, it's like, I'm endeared towards her. So I can't fully hate her the way I hate the rest of this movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I hate this movie. I still give it a sort of maybe like a 2.5 stars. But I also completely understand why anyone would hate it, and I don't really disagree with any criticisms of it. So, yeah, I mean, so Ron Woodruff is a real character, as you mentioned. Some of the facts are kind of disputed, but a lot of people have said that he was not as homophobic or maybe even homophobic at all as he is in this movie. This movie I mean, Matthew McConaughey is like level 10 homophobic, like it would be hard to make him more homophobic without him actually like killing someone.
Right. So, yeah.
So like I'm a screenwriter, so I understand like the drive toward, and like if you find a character like this, like there is like it's like you want to get that like larger than life character. I mean, I'm not speaking as myself, but I'm trying to kind of imagine like the genesis of this movie. It's like you find an article about this guy who is a colorful character, and then you kind of push those colors like to more extremes because that makes, kind of a more interesting movie and draws talent to the role.
He's Tiger King.
Yeah.
He's the Tiger King.
But with AIDS.
With AIDS. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I mean, it's absolutely true. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's just like, and like coming into this podcast, I was thinking like, okay, these are two of the AIDS movies out there. And started trying to think about the rest of them, and there aren't really that many more. There are a lot that touch on it, or have, some part of it, but there aren't that many that are like stories with like protagonists with AIDS, and that's kind of like a major aspect of the story. So yeah, it seems like such a strange choice now, 10 years later, to kind of say like, it's been 20 years since Philadelphia. I think, we're ready for another like AIDS story. Like, what if it was a straight man who was like really homophobic? Like,
Right.
like just of all the stories to tell, like you say, like there are other buyers clubs that were out there. There are other kinds of ways to tell a similar story if you want to. And it's just, I think it's just, kind of the contrast of like, oh, a homophobe with AIDS, that's an interesting story, kind of inherently, just because of the conflict it implies. But
Well, you also give him the arc of learning to love Rayon, the trans character, who they're constantly at odds until she dies. And then, he's very sad about it that she dies. But meanwhile, they misgender her the entire movie. Did you notice that?
oh yeah, I noticed that. Right. I mean, so I think at the time, in 2013, I think a lot, well, and the movie is taking place in like the 80s. So I think it's true that a lot of people would do that. But it doesn't seem like the movie itself is very consistent about who is calling her what gender when, because I feel like they misgender her, but they also occasionally like don't.
I, if,
And
I feel like she's the only one that genders herself as as a female.
but
And when
I
talking about herself, she does.
yeah, and I just think the writers are not not very well educated on what a trans
Yeah.
person, what their experience would actually be. I believe the writers are both straight. I tried to find out a little bit more, and that was the conclusion I got, but I didn't do a ton of research. Um, but yeah, I mean, she's a composite character, they say. So I think, there are people who were somewhat like Rayon, sort of in this story somewhere. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of confusion. It honestly was like a interesting testament to just how far we've come in 10 years, because that wasn't something that I think most people noticed in 2013, and now it just sounded wrong every time they said he.
Yeah.
And
I would
so
I would say that it's not something that, and I'll confess I didn't notice it either, but because we're both cis, and I think that trans people watching this movie absolutely probably noticed it in 2013.
oh sure, yeah, that's a great note to make, because I do think that there are people who did, and that I just was not as
I
aware of.
wasn't either. Yeah, for sure. I definitely wasn't educated on that aspect, and it wasn't something I noticed before, for sure. So
No, there's a scene where Rayon like puts on a suit to go visit his or her father, I guess, depending on which pronouns you're going to use, if you're going to use the movie's pronouns or the ones that seem more appropriate. And especially it's confusing in that scene because he's now dressed in male clothing. But
her father refers to her as Raymond.
right,
And I feel like you could make an argument that in that scene she's Raymond, because
exactly,
that's how she's being perceived by the father. And
right,
she's put the clothes on to make herself more palatable to get this money.
which is just I mean, it's a kind of a weird scene in a lot of ways, but it's just like I get why she would put on male clothing, but it's weird kind of to put on a suit just to go visit your father because he's a lawyer. But it's like, I guess you're going into his law firm, but like, I don't know. It seemed like an odd choice. Like, where is she even getting a suit?
So I didn't. There was a lot about this movie that I didn't like, but I actually thought that the suit, because the suit makes sense because it's the most masculine thing that she can think of to wear to go to this office, and also she's trying to impress her dad, or like she's trying to get money out of her dad, so she's going to present herself. She's going to put her best foot forward. And her dad, who is a lawyer and is in a suit in the movie and works in this like big prestigious office, like is going to respond more to a suit than short jeans and a t-shirt.
Yeah, I like the idea of exploring that. And I think if the movie had been a little bit clearer just about like what her gender identity was.
Right. Like the movie doesn't give her the credit that I just did. But
right, yeah.
yeah.
I think it would be really interesting to see a trans character do something like that, but because it was already a little bit confusing, because people she's supposedly very close to are calling her a he, then to see her dressed in male clothing kind of in this willing way, like, I don't know, it added further confusion, where I was just like, I don't feel like this movie understands, like, has an idea of what, gender she feels like she is, or, just hasn't really established what her gender identity is in relation to the people around her that she would be close with, that she would probably, want to say like, hey, by the way,
right.
maybe you could refer to me as she. Anyway, and that just seemed like, again, like kind of like a scene that was a little Oscar baity. I'll just use the word, or a little bit like, it just felt like it was the like kind of gasp moment for the audience of like, oh, like this is what she really looks like, or something like that.
Do you know who else was nominated that year?
It was 2013.
I do remember that that was the year that I wanted Leonardo DiCaprio should have won for Wolf of Wall Street.
Oh yeah, 100%. I love the Wolf
that was
of Wall Street.
That was my, like, at the time I was banging that drum. I still think that's his best performance. I think the Revenant win was an apology win for not winning the role he should have won. I think Matthew McConaughey should have won supporting for Magic Mike a year earlier. Because I thought he was fantastic in that. But this performance, I think, is just, he just lost a bunch of weight, and then he just walked in and he's like, I'm Matthew McConaughey and I'm a homophobe. And that's his performance.
Yeah, this was the time, like, the term McConaissance was term coined. And I think it was one of the first of those, and now, like, everyone has a essence of some kind. But it was the one that kind of, he really was like coming up from behind at this point and had kind of been washed out. So he was definitely like in that way, like due for the Oscar. I agree about Magic Mike. I thought he was definitely my pick for that. This was a good year for Best Actor because it was Leonardo DiCaprio, who was also my choice, but also Chiwetel Ejiofor for 12 Years a Slave. Which is a great performance. Bruce Dern in Nebraska also. So I think I liked Matthew McConaughey's performance, but I liked those other three that were nominated more than this one. For supporting actor, it wasn't like a super strong year. It was like Jonah Hill for Wolf of Wall Street, Michael Fassbender for 12 Years a Slave, Bradley Cooper for American Hustle, and Barkhad Abdi for Captain Phillips. So
to my mind, that listening to that, like, that's Michael Fassbender all the way.
Yes, I mean, I 100% think Michael Fassbender should have an Oscar. I would give it to him for shame, personally, but I mean, that wasn't like one of his greatest roles, or like even the movie. Like, Lupita Nyong'o was a lot more standout. She won,
She did win. I do remember that. Yeah.
So, I think in that crop, it sort of makes sense. It's definitely like the showiest performance of those. And I will say, I don't hate Jared Leto's performance. Like, he would not be cast now. I at least not without like a huge, outrageous firestorm that would probably have him then uncast.
Or at
But
the very least, like wouldn't have been nominated for an Oscar.
yeah,
Even if it was happened and they went through with it and they made the movie, they would actively not
right,
even submit him probably.
Things have changed a lot in those 10 years. And so some of what doesn't work around that character, I think, is cultural. And yes, they probably should have done more research to give an accurate portrayal. And I feel like the character is just caught somewhere between like doing drag and being trans. Like that at the time, a lot of people I think didn't know how to distinguish between those two things. And that's kind of where the character falls in that like, because she's also doing like a very like big kind of, like she's very showy, especially in some of her early scenes. And she's like a fun character, I think. Like she like livens up the movie when she's there, like especially when they're like playing cards or something. Like she's a welcome presence, maybe only because he's so toxic that it's like, like someone that I can at least like sort of, that I might actually want to be around in real life. Maybe questionable, but so I think
if she wasn't stoned on heroin, then yeah,
right,
absolutely.
yeah, that is exactly what made me qualify that. I was like, she was kind of a major drug addict as well, so maybe not someone I want to invite into my life, but I think she has a fun presence in the movie, so in that way I kind of like her. But I think like she's more acting like a drag queen especially those early scenes where she's being like kind of big and showy, and like she's acting like she's performing and on stage, and I think that those things are just being kind of conflated in a way that's not actually accurate to most people.
And I think if drag queens like don't put makeup on and dress up when they're not performing.
No, they don't. And so, I think like they're acting as if she is a drag queen that is going to perform at her hospital visit. And this, because she's the
movie doesn't know. I feel like the movie doesn't know the difference, or doesn't know if she is trans or a transvestite. And I think the movie doesn't know the difference between those two terms.
Right.
And I think they're more treating it like a transvestite, which is someone who just dresses in women's clothes, who is a man who dresses in women's clothes, who identifies as a man and dresses in women's clothes. That's what a transvestite is, at least as far as I understand it. If I'm wrong.
Right. Yeah.
Don't at
me. So, I mean, I think part of that is just like sort of where culture was. So I don't want to rest that all on just this.
Right. And like I said, like, and even in the case of Philadelphia, and I wanted to go back to this. This is kind of the key to, or the point that I wanted to get to in pairing the two movies is, like I said, I remember watching it in 2013 and thinking, boy, it's been 20 years since Philadelphia and we can't do any better. I can forgive Philadelphia for being, for casting straight people in queer roles and making the focus of that story the straight guy and the lawsuit rather than the reality of queer people dying of AIDS. I can forgive Philadelphia that. I find it harder to forgive this movie that, because it feels like they actively ignored a lot of the science. They made a queer character straight, and it spits and it creates this trans character from whole cloth. I understand create like an amalgamation of the doctors, the idea of creating a Jennifer Garner character to represent, for it to be one person to telling them all this medical facts, I think in a story structure makes perfect sense. That's fine. But it's creating this maybe trans, maybe transvestite character, actively not understanding them, and then using factually incorrect science to tell your story. It feels like a slap in the face. in a way that Philadelphia doesn't. Philadelphia feels like a well-meaning movie made by people who wanted to bring light to this topic. Dallas Buyers Club feels like a movie made by people who saw Philadelphia and wanted to win Oscars.
Yeah, I guess that brings up like the other thing that I think honestly probably bothered me more than anything about like the gender or sexuality is just like the way that this movie treats medicine and science,
Yeah.
which plays really differently after the past couple of years because
Yeah, I thought about
we
that, definitely. Yeah.
we've been through COVID where obviously particularly conservative people just basically became like total deniers of, not that
Yeah.
they weren't in some ways before, but deniers of like medicine and science, and just kind of went rogue and were like, oh, like I don't want to like do the treatment that all the doctors are saying I should do.
Right.
I'm going to find this random drug down in Mexico and I'm going to take
Right.
that and give it to and tell everyone else they should take it. And it plays like really wild now, and I'm just like, what are you doing? Like, certainly the FDA and like the medical establishment deserve, scrutiny and criticism for many things, including around AIDS. But also like this movie treats Matthew McConaughey's character as if he's like really got the answer when he's like not a doctor and
Right.
just getting like random drugs from Mexico and like basically prescribing them to people, stealing like a prescription pad so he can write
Yeah.
prescriptions. It's very irresponsible, and I think it's supposed to be fun at the time, but now that we are just close to another epidemic where this kind of thing happened, in a very different way, it's kind of like wild to like have a movie that's rooting for this kind of character, and he's also like a huge bigot. It's just
Yeah.
like, what is this supposed hero that I'm supposed to be rooting for here?
Exactly. And I think that's one of the important, interesting stories about these buyer clubs that it's worth telling, and how they were getting their information and how they were getting their drugs. And in that situation, we know now that the FDA put a limit on these drugs and tried to stop people from getting them. And one of the most telling things, I think, comes late in the movie, very, very near the end, when Jennifer Garner's character, Eve, is basically like, why are these people now allowed to get this drug? And the doctor's like, because they're dying. And there are no long-term effects. We're just delaying the inevitable. And there's a truth to that I want to see explored in a movie that wants to explore that. This movie's not interested in that. I think it kind of just is playing to the rafters. I think it's trying to get those Oscars and those brownie points, and it wants to like point out that AIDS is bad. But it doesn't feel like it has any skin in the game. And it feels like it's coming from a very sort of this Oscar bait. It's the quintessential Oscar bait movie.
Yeah, and the way that it portrays AIDS, particularly this time, just struck me as like very ghoulish, especially around like Rayon's death. Like, I mean, I had a hard time like articulating exactly like what the difference was, and I think it's just maybe the writing and that the characters aren't believable enough that like their suffering feels earned, so it just kind of feels like off-putting and just kind of like miserable to be watching them kind of basically waste away and die in this way. Like it wasn't well written enough to kind of justify the kind of ugly places it had to go in a couple of places.
Yeah. Like I said, I want I'll take a documentary. I like documentaries about these people who were there and doing that. And like I said too, I've read enough queer history to know, like I said, that lesbians were the unsung heroes. And I want to know those stories, and I want to hear about that, because that's the reality of what happened. This feels like I said, it really just feels like a movie that they threw together, taking a bunch of elements they knew were Oscar friendly, and that was their whole point. Because it doesn't feel like, and you know, I mentioned Jared Leto's Oscar sort of campaign. Like, it doesn't even feel like he learned anything from the movie and from this experience of playing this character. And it doesn't really feel like McConaughey did either, from what I remember of reading about him at the time. It purely feels the cynical ploy to just win some Oscars, and we're gonna make this movie, and it's gonna make people cry, and they're gonna give us an Oscar. And the idea that it won, and the idea that it beat all those great performances that you just mentioned. I can understand it beating Jonah Hill, Jared Leto beating Jonah Hill, but to beat DiCaprio, Bruce Dern, 12 Years a Slave, really? Come on.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned earlier, but it's just 20 years later. I guess it felt like, in a way, safe to make this movie. Like Philadelphia wasn't like a safe movie to make. It wasn't a safe bet really in any way. And this movie does feel like a safe bet, you know, in that way of like, it feels like it's not taking any risks in the way it's portraying the characters, in the way that it's casting this movie, in the way that it's just having, you know, a straight man with AIDS in the center of it, which, by the way, I mean, like, when Hollywood was first considering doing an AIDS movie back in 93, the other scripts that were in contention were all straight people with AIDS. And Philadelphia was like the one that luckily was, so it could have been worse in that way, but it was like, coming, you know, 20 years later, it's just, there's such an opportunity, I think, for, you know, 20 years later to have some distance and to maybe even like look deeper than Philadelphia did. And, you know, with more distance, Philadelphia was coming right off of the 80s, but this movie really could have looked at the 80s like much more critically. And instead it really just indicts sort of vague doctor characters who don't really feel like real people. And the good doctor is also, she's actually a terrible doctor. I mean, she's a nice person, but she's a really bad doctor. She does not seem
we will not have any Jennifer Garner slander on this podcast.
It's not her, it's her.
No, I know.
The character, like, Ron Woodruff is like telling her medical things, and she's like, oh really? Like, it's just like, did you go to medical school or not, lady? Like,
that's just another symptom of like lazy script writing. That's another symptom of like, we have to get this information to the audience so they understand it. So where are we going to put this in the screenplay where someone's explaining it to somebody? It would have made more sense if she was explaining it to him.
Right. And like, there's a way to like, that this movie really could have, you know, pushed some envelopes and really like criticize like what was going on in the culture at this time. Instead, it really doesn't even like it just goes after this one sort of like problem with the medicine, but it really doesn't put it in any kind of like larger cultural context of what was going on in the 80s. It just feels very like cut off from the rest of the world and cut off from reality. And I mean, it's.
Well, I mean, I think that's what you get when you work backwards from how are we going to win an Oscar? You get these broad strokes of, I'm going to play a guy with AIDS. I'm going to play a guy that's dying, you know, and we're going to put a queer character in there, and, you know, that'll get an Oscar, and I'll get an Oscar. I did want to, since we're talking about Oscars, I want to mention the fact that it won Best Makeup. That must have been a rough year for makeup. Was there not a Marvel movie out that year? Like what? I didn't look it up, but the makeup isn't bad by any means, but it's also not, I don't know,
Okay.
Oscar worthy.
The other contenders were The Lone Ranger and Jackass Presents Bad Grandpa.
Oh, okay, fair. Again, oh fuck. What a
So
wow.
the
Okay.
other alternative was that Jackass Presents Bad Grandpa would be an Oscar-winning movie. So I
And
guess
that you give it the Oscar for putting an old man makeup on Johnny Knoxville, or you give, what was the other one?
Lone Ranger.
Oh
Yeah.
my God. Okay, that is the lone category that I also would have voted Dallas Buyers Club in the
Hmm.
Oscars. I did. Like I said, I wanted to talk about these two movies together, because I remember my initial reaction in 2013 to Dallas Buyers Club is like, boy, we sure haven't come any further than Philadelphia. And it's a real shame. Um,
Well, I
because
think
you're
this movie went really far backwards, though. Is
so
the
that's the point. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
what I'm saying, is that like in 20 years we should have elevated way beyond it, but instead we're going backwards. And I'm not saying you need, 3 movies a year about gay people dying of AIDS, but for there to have, you're right, I can't think of one between these two movies. But they're probably out there, but I'm not thinking. And I know there's It's My Party, which I don't know when that came out, but anyway, it just feels like Hollywood 20 years later, 2013, and even 10 years after that, like, doesn't they're still trying to figure out how to tell gay stories, how to tell queer stories. And AIDS and HIV is a very real part of our lives as gay men. I don't know about you. I know many people who are HIV positive. I'm grateful that like science has come so far that those friends of mine will be around for a long time. It's no longer a death sentence. But at the same time, the only thing since Dallas Buyers Club that I can really think of with any mainstream exposure is Pose.
Yeah, Ryan Murphy's done a couple, like he did the Normal Heart movie, which was a TV movie. So there's a couple things. I think there was another show or two. But yeah, it really hasn't been a part of, the big Hollywood conversation. Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably still stories to be told, more so about kind of like the failure of like the government, and like a better story about kind of the medical side of
Yeah.
things,
Yeah.
than this is. Have you seen All the Beauty and the Bloodshed yet? The Oscar
No.
nominated documentary. So that is a movie that I think it's really smartly kind of connects some of the dots between AIDS and COVID, and just the way that government and institutions kind of respond to these plagues, and not even just those two. It's also about the opioid crisis and
Yeah.
mental illness. So it's just kind of more of a holistic look about how the government tends to fail to respond to these kinds of crises. So that is a really great documentary from this year that I think is kind of tackling the side of the story that I think needs maybe still some telling, which is just like that for the longest time, gay people and people with AIDS were kind of just like left hung out to dry with this, and weren't receiving like the help that they needed. So yeah, I and because this Dallas Buyers Club is so close to that, like I really wish I had gone deeper and actually kind of tackled some of that. But
yeah, like I said, to me it just feels like the most sort of cynical sort of Oscar bait. Can we find you on social media? Are you on any other podcasts we should know about?
I am. Thank you for reminding me. I am on a podcast that I co-host with a couple of friends called When We Were Young. which tackles 80s and 90s movies, sometimes music and TV too. But basically just kind of looking back at what we were watching then or what was popular then and kind of seeing, how it does or doesn't hold up today. So you can find us there if you'd like to. And I'm also on Letterboxd at Real Nobody, REAL Nobody. If you care to read various, sometimes well thought out and sometimes, kind of slapdash movie reviews from me.
I like your movie reviews on Letterboxd. And whenever there's a new one, I always make sure to read it.
Oh, thank you.
It's always nice to get your perspective. That's why I like having it. I like you on the show and talking about these things. It's always a great talk. So thank you again. If you want to find me on social media, I am So Brian Rowe. That's Brian with an I, ROWE. I'm on Instagram and Letterboxd. You can find the podcast on Instagram and YouTube at Piece of Pie Pod. Give us a like, give us a follow. Make sure you're subscribed. I feel like our next episode is probably going to be the Oscars. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it because it's going to be a great chat. And I'm looking forward to it. Until then, go watch the movie and we'll see you next time.